In the last section, we talked about the first steps of composition, the fact that we want to identify our main subject. We then discussed how our vision works, or how we see. The fact that we have only a narrow band of sharp focus has great impact on how we look at photographs. We focus from point to point and gather information, and then very quickly our brains identify what we're looking at. Because of this type of vision, it becomes imperative to us as visual artists to control where the viewer's eye is led. So, how do we do that? How do we guide our viewers through a photograph? Well, there are several things that have a very high visual appeal, things that we as humans will focus on first. I call them distractions and attractions. Here's a few of them. We're going to begin with the bright areas of a photograph. These are very, very typically the first things that we'll look at in an image. So, here's my attempt to photograph fall foliage. But the fact that the water is so bright and is so large in the frame, we can't help but look at that first. Now, if I want my viewer to think fall foliage when they're looking at my photographs, I don't want them to go to the water first. The water should be an accent or a secondary subject. And the fall foliage, the color, in this case red, should be the main subject. Walking down the stream a little bit, looking for a better composition, I came up with this. Notice how your eye goes right to the red. The river is still in the frame, but it truly is a secondary subject rather than the primary subject. Those bright areas are always going to attract your eye. In this shot of a giraffe, the head is well composed, but the bright areas right behind it really take your eye away. Compare that photograph to this one. Without the bright areas, you are so much more focused on the giraffe itself. The giraffe is now the brightest thing in the photograph. This helps draw you to the subject. In this photograph of a wildflower, there's one bright area up in the upper left-hand corner. And even though it's somewhat out of focus, it still draws our eye. It takes us away from the flower. The flower is going to look much more brilliant when the white spot is gone. And this was just simply a matter of moving my tripod about 1/2 of an inch. In this image, the white area is also very distracting. Notice in this upper corner here, in this area here, the white just dominates. Even though my eye was drawn to these shapes down in here, notice how this rock points right up into this area here. This is where my photograph truly is. Now, I included this as a horizontal because I really liked the stream and I thought that was an important part of the photograph, showing how the stream rolls through. But in retrospect, after looking at it, the white area is just too much. A little post-processing or cropping in camera, or perhaps a vertical composition at the time of shooting, could have helped that and made it look more like this. Now the brightest area in the photograph is right here and right here. It's sort of the focal point. Just because something is bright doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't take a photograph. There's no way that I wouldn't take a photograph of this young boy just because he was wearing a white shirt. His eyes are very strong, and there's no question that we should be looking at the child rather than the white of the shirt or the hat. In cases like this, portrait photographers will often use something that's called vignetting. And that's the darkening down of the corners, just a little bit to draw your eye into the center of the frame. So once again, before, no vignetting. After, with vignetting added. Really pushes your eye to the center of the frame. In this shot, there's no question what the main subject is. It's, of course, the white boat. The fact that it is so bright helps the composition. It's also in a very strong position in the frame, which we'll get to later in this video. But it being so bright, your eye goes right to there, and then eventually wanders around and looks at the rest of the photograph. In this image of the lighthouse, it's very clear as to what the brightest objects are. And this does well because our eye is drawn into them, and it's, as a photographer, it's where I want you to look. The sky is interesting, but I want it to be a secondary subject, the movement in the clouds. I want that to accent the lighthouse. But the car lights on the bottom and the lighthouse itself are the main subjects. This image was captured in a Reynolds mansion off the coast of Georgia, and there's a lot of light pouring in from the overhead glass ceiling. It's a good exposure. Any brighter and things would start to blow out. But I think the eye is more drawn to the ceiling itself because it's so bright. Watch what happens after a little bit of Photoshop work and just brightening up the foreground. The eye goes much quicker down to the tables and chairs and doesn't linger so long up in the glass ceiling. And this is what I want the viewer to look at. I want you to look at the pillars and the statues and the chairs rather than necessarily just the ceiling. High contrast. This is a real pull for the eye. It's a toss-up between which is worse or better, as the case may be, between bright areas and high contrast. They're both extremely alluring, and as human beings we pay a lot of attention to them, both out in the natural world and in photographs. Look at how these lines of contrast are formed by the shadows of the trees. And in this case, these lines are all pointing right to the center of the photograph. This is a pretty good use of high contrast. Same thing in this image. Here we've got a high contrast line where this white meets the dark, and again where the light meets the dark here. The waterfall itself actually is another line of contrast. So this image is fairly successful. Now, going back to what we had just talked about, look at this bright area here in the upper corner. Not so good. If I was to print this image, I would probably darken down that corner with Photoshop, or if I'd have been thinking at the moment that I photographed it, I could have used a split neutral density filter to darken that down, strengthening the high contrast area here. Another area of high contrast. Notice this orange against the dark here. This sets up a very sensuous circular line that goes throughout here. And it kind of puts our vision right into here. This becomes secondary. This becomes our primary form right in here. Using contrast to aid your composition. Here, just notice where your eyes go. Look around the image for a little bit. You're probably looking first at this bright area here, and then perhaps along this line up here. It's interesting because in the previous section we talked about bright areas of the photograph, and if those bright areas are very close to a dark area, then that sets up the contrast itself, and that becomes our line of contrast. So oftentimes bright areas and lines of contrast go hand in hand. Here you can see very plainly how your eye is drawn to this bright area and these lines of contrast. Here and then here. And same thing with this image. Even though the boat is so small, it does stand out pretty well against the white because it is so dark. So the two main focus points of this image are here and then here. What's running a close third? Well, probably the wake. Now, here's an example of a low contrast image. In this case, the trees are almost the same brightness as the rocks behind them. It's very hard for us to make out what it is. Whereas you take another situation, a tree against a rock, where you have more contrast, one stands out from another. Here you're really focused on the overall shape of the image, which of course is drawn by the lines of contrast. Color contrast. This is one that people often forget about. Now, in order to understand color contrast, you have to take a look at the color wheel. Here we've got our reds going into magenta, purple and blue into what's called cyan, green, yellow, and back to orange. Well, color contrast is a series of opposites. So, contrasting colors would be green against magenta, or yellow against blue, or red against cyan. So look at these images. Notice how where the blue and orange meets, you get a line of contrast. This color contrast is very strong, and it has a lot of impact on the viewer. Here you've got magenta and green in the foreground. In this image we've got orange and purple. In this example of the San Francisco Bridge, this was shot on daylight, and the overall light sources are tungsten, so the image is somewhat polluted with this overall orange color. There's very little color contrast. Now, when I set my camera correctly and put it onto daylight, or I'm sorry, not daylight mode, but set it to auto mode, it fixed it. Now, same image, just two different color modes. Look at the difference in color contrast here. This is a far superior image simply because we're separating out our subjects by color. We do have contrasting colors, but we also have colors that are close together. These are called analogous colors. And here you can see that red and yellow are pretty close together. Of course, you mix them and you get orange. But when you have scenes that are comprised of mostly analogous colors, then there's going to be more color harmony rather than dissonance. So in the previous examples, we saw a lot of contrast, which adds a lot of pop and snap to your images. When you use analogous colors, what you get is a little bit more harmony. So using reds and yellows or greens and blues, you'll see that harmony. So in this example, there's a fair amount of color contrast. We have yellows and oranges, and we have greens and blues over here. Look what happens when we bring the colors closer together as the lights change. You're now looking at more the overall form or the overall shapes rather than the colors themselves. Here you're focused more on the fence and the curve of the line here. The previous example, you're more focused on the difference between the colors, the color contrast themselves. Color contrast, color harmony. Which is better? Neither. All depends on what you want to do with your photograph. In this example, we have blue and yellow together, and of course that's causing a lot of color contrast. And a similar fall scene, reds and yellows. These are analogous colors. Notice how they blend in. It's not quite so harsh. Areas of sharpness. This application is better understood and more widely known than that, say, of color contrast. This theory states that when something is sharp, your eye will examine it, and when something is out of focus, your eye will tend to ignore it. In this image, the entire frame is sharp. Notice where your eye goes first, though. The pink flower. Part of this is because of the color contrast between the pink and the green. But after looking at the flower, you can scan the rest of the scene to take in all the detail. And you do this because it's sharp. In this version, though, your eye tends to stay on the pink flower. Sure, you'll go around and examine the other areas, but you won't stay there very long. When the eye cannot bring something into focus, it tires and goes back to something that is sharp. It's much more comfortable for our eyes to look at something that is sharp rather than looking at something that's out of focus. In this photo, we have a store filled with candy jars. Now, if the entire shot was sharp, we would examine every detail in this image. Because only the front jar is sharp, our eyes tend to stay here. The question then is, do we need to have everything sharp? Well, by making everything sharp, you're telling the viewer everything is important. Examine the entire scene. But with a narrow band of focus, you're telling your viewer, this is the only thing that's truly important. Spend most of your time looking here. Again, that's not to say that your viewer will not look at other parts of the image. They will. It's just they won't spend as much time there. In this backlit poppy, there should be no question as to what the main subject is. It's the lines formed by the stem. The rest of the image is simply a wash of color. Now, this works perfectly as a secondary subject. Because it's out of focus, it's going to enhance the main subject. If the background was more complex, it would compete for attention with the main stem. So the narrow band of focus on the stem allows it to stand out and be a strong main subject. This photograph of candy is a prime example of how sharpness draws the eye. Because this image is comprised of repeating shapes, it becomes necessary to separate out the main subject somehow. If not, it would all be the same thing. It would become a very boring photograph. So, like the other shots preceding this was photographed with a very large aperture. In this case, it was f1.8. Other large apertures, such as 2 or f2.8, will also provide shallow depth of field. Now, this narrow band of focus, or shallow depth of field, leaves just one area sharp so as to draw the eye. You're drawn right to, in this case, into the center of the frame, but mainly you're looking at this piece of candy right here. It's the only area that's sharp. Our eye tends to ignore everything else. Of course, we understand the rest of it is candy, but we're not forced to stay out here and examine it. In this photograph of the scale and macaroons, we don't have repeating shapes or patterns as in the previous image, but I did want to draw your attention to the macaroons. This was an advertising shot for a candy store, and they wanted the focus to be on the candy. The scale then is acting as a supporting subject, suggesting tradition or an older era. I want you to be able to make it out, but I don't want you spending a lot of time there. Keeping it somewhat out of focus by using a large aperture achieves that. The narrow area of focus and the fact that this area is brighter keeps your attention right where I want it, right on the macaroons. In this close-up of a purple pincushion flower, I had the need to use a narrow depth of field to separate the yellow points in the front from the ones in the back. If it was all sharp, it would become very, very confusing. So the little yellow dots are everywhere, and because they're not in a real uniform pattern, I need to separate them, and I need to say, I want to focus on just these two right here. All these other ones in the background are going to go out of focus. So again, I'm using a very narrow band of focus, very small or very large aperture, again, such as 1.8, to achieve that background being out of focus. This photo of the fall foliage is a really good example of how a small area of sharpness can give the impression of depth to an image. As photographers, we're always trying to display three-dimensional subjects on a two-dimensional plane, whether that's in print or on a computer screen. The more depth clues we can add, the more successful the image is going to be. In this shot, by keeping the leaves in the front sharp and the background ones out of focus, I'm giving the impression of depth as well as highlighting the line of leaves here. Now, eyes of people or animals. This attraction goes along with areas of sharpness. As people, we look to the eyes of other folks or animals to determine the situation. I'm sure this comes from our distant history and probably has its roots in survival, but as photographers, we're mainly concerned with making a dramatic or meaningful image. In this shot of the cat, the eyes are bright, and the only thing in the image that is really, truly tack sharp. So these circumstances both lead to a successful portrait of the cat. Look at the difference with this portrait of a wallaby. Here the body is sharp, but the eyes are not. When you look at it, it's a little disturbing or off-putting. It seems like something is not quite right. Again, this was a very shallow depth of field. Of course, the wallaby was moving, so I needed a fast shutter speed, and that made me open up to f2.8. But when I get my focus correct and it's actually on the eyes, even though they're dark, you're still drawn to them. We want to look in there. We want to see what's happening. What is this animal going to do? Here you can see the fur is not quite as sharp as it was in the previous image, as you can see here. But if the eyes are sharp, that's all that matters. This is a portrait of a friend of mine named Grant. He was a former Photoshop student of mine. And as I was teaching, I noticed that his reading glasses really matched his eyes and face, so I asked if I could take a picture of him. And this is one of the first images. It really doesn't say anything particular about his eyes or his glasses. So I began trying different compositions and f-stops, and I settled on this frame. The closer cropping and larger aperture throw everything out of focus except the eyes and glasses. So this shot is more successful in portraying my original intention. The bottom line is that when you have people or animals in your image, it's imperative that the eyes are sharp, even if everything else is out of focus. It's all that matters. Eyes are sharp. Colors in a monochromatic scene. A strong or saturated color is a really bold element when placed against a neutral background. The intense color has an appeal that's really hard to resist. As you can see in this image, the colors of the canoe and life vest really stand out against the desaturated background. Even though the background is sharp, it doesn't compete with the canoe for attention. You can see a similar effect here with this red ground cover. Although there is a strong line of contrast from the mountains to the sky up in here, we're still mainly attracted to the ground cover down here. So in a case like this, what you might do is initially go here to look at the ground cover. Your eye will come up, see the contrast, realize what it is, and eventually come back down in here. So the eye movement in this photograph might jump back and forth between these two items, and that's okay. Here the bright trees and orange leaves stand out against the more neutral, darker, and desaturated backdrop. Again, an effective way of drawing your viewer's attention to the main subject. Now this image has a really strong circle of orange at the bottom. Notice how your eye jumps right to this spot. But where else does your eye roam to? Well, if you're anything like me, the next area you might examine would be the lighter metal in the middle. This is surrounded by a darker field of gray or black, and this lighter spot is also a draw just simply because it's brighter. But where these lines meet, this becomes an area of high contrast again. So look at this now. This entire circle is a draw to our viewer because color in a monochromatic scene, brighter area, and an area of high contrast. So, distractions and attractions. These are the areas of the photograph that have strong visual appeal. When the main subjects exhibit these characteristics, you will have an easy to understand image. If the background or secondary subjects have one or more of these same characteristics, you may find that they start to compete with the main subject, thus rendering your image less effective. Now, in the upcoming section, number 3, we're going to go over elements of composition.